Smoke clawed at Isolde's throat before she even crossed the threshold of the great hall. King Davos stood at the brazier, her family's bronze crest already blackening in the flames, and he did not look at her once. He looked at Nerys instead. Nerys, draped in a Luna's cloak she had not earned, warming her pale hands by the fire as though the burning were a gift meant for her. The gathered packs watched in silence. No one moved. Isolde could feel the heat from where she stood 10 feet back, her boots on cold stone, her name being unmade, in front of every bloodline that had ever bent the knee to hers. Davos lifted his chin and spoke loud enough for the rafters. "The line ends here," he said. "Declare it yourself, or I'll declare it for you." She had no idea that the smoke rising from that crest was not an ending. It was a signal. Somewhere, beyond the Wolfsbane citadel, in halls older than Davos's crown and colder than his ambition, the ancient bloodlines had waited 100 years for exactly this moment, and now at last they had seen the beacon. The smoke was still in the air when Isolde awoke. Not the sharp smoke of a hearth fire, but something older, something that clung to the stone walls of Wolfsbane citadel, the way a secret clings to a room long after the people have gone. She lay still for a moment, listening. The citadel had a sound at dawn. A low, settling groan like the bones of an old thing adjusting to the cold. This morning it sounded different. Quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. The kind that means something has already been decided without you. She rose before the servants came. That was her habit, had been her habit since her grandmother first placed her hands over hers and showed her how to fold the old white cloth. It was a burial cloth, technically. Her grandmother had always laughed at that, called it a practical thing, said a family that keeps its linens folded keeps its dignity. The cloth was cream white, now gone thin at the edges and embroidered at the center with the crest of her bloodline, a river running through an open gate. Isolde folded it the way she'd been taught twice, lengthwise once across, pressed flat with the heel of her palm. She set it at the foot of the Luna's ceremonial chest. She did not let herself think about who would open that chest next. The elderly servant arrived with the tea before the first bell. A chipped silver cup tarnished at the rim, and the bitter root brew that Isolde had never once enjoyed and never once refused. The cup still carried the stamped mark of her family on the base, a small thing, worn nearly smooth. Almost every other object like it had been quietly replaced over the past weeks. New linens, new flagons, new candle holders bearing a different crest. But this cup had survived. The old woman set it down without a word and kept her eyes low. And Isolde understood that silence, too. Some loyalties can't be spoken. They can only be handed across in a chipped cup. She drank it standing at the window. Then she set the cup down and went to work. Isolde moved through the lower corridors herself that morning, checking the winter stores against the record she kept in her own hand. The armory corridor ran along the north wall, and the north wall was always the last to be thought of. She counted the blanket stock, found it short, and sent 2 of the younger runners to pull the reserve bundles from the secondary storeroom. The lower servants wouldn't ask. They never did. They'd simply be cold, and she'd simply prevent it, and no one upstairs would notice either way. That was fine. That had always been fine. It was on her way back through the gallery corridor that she heard the whispers. 2 women voices dropped low, not low enough. Nerys had been in the record vault again. Old scrolls this time. Broken seals. The kind of seals that meant documents had been opened and not rebound by their rightful custodians. Isolde kept walking. She did not slow her step, but something in her chest pulled tight like a knot being tested. She didn't see Nerys. She felt her first. That was the thing about Nerys. She moved through a room the way weather moves through a valley. You noticed the effect before you saw the cause. A banner in the eastern corridor had been rehung. Isolde's grandmother's portrait, which had stood at the end of the Luna's hall for 30 years, had been turned to face the wall. Not removed, just turned, as if the woman in the painting were being made to look away. Isolde stopped in front of it for a long moment. She reached up and turned it back. Then she walked on. She heard the words later pass to her through the careful silence of someone who trusted her. Nerys had been speaking to King Davos in the lower study. The king hesitated. He always hesitated, caught between what he wanted and what the old law required. Ancestral law still bound the throne. A Luna's bloodline carried legal weight, ceremonial weight. the weight of generations who had ratified the Pack's covenant through their own bodies and names. Nerys understood that. She understood it well enough to want it gone. A king does not need permission from the dead, she had said. Clean, simple, the kind of sentence that sounds like reason and acts like a blade. Isolde stood in the Luna's chambers that evening and looked at the folded cloth on the chest. She thought about what she actually was to this citadel. Not a woman, not a consort, not even a rival. She was a seal. She was the last living mark on a law that someone wanted to erase the way you'd scrape a name from old wax. Nerys didn't need to break her. She just needed Davos to move and the law would break on its own. She could feel the citadel cooling around her, not the cold of the north wall. Something else, the cold of rooms where decisions get made and your name isn't in them. She picked up the chipped silver cup from the windowsill where she'd left it, turned it over in her hands. The family mark was still there, faint but present. She set it back down. She was not finished yet. Isolde stood in the great hall with her spine straight, even as the cold bit through her skin. Davos had summoned every pack within 50 leagues. They lined the vaulted space shoulders, broad eyes fixed on what was about to happen. She could feel their hunger not for food, but for the spectacle of a house falling. The king sat on his throne, unsmiling. Nerys stood beside him in a Luna's cloak, the silver clasp catching the firelight. She had not earned it. Everyone in that hall knew it. Isolde's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Davos rose. His voice rolled through the chamber smooth as oil on still water. For 3 centuries, the House of Firehook has claimed dominion over the northern territories. For 3 centuries, their crest has stood as law. He paused. He was a man who understood the weight of silence. That age has ended. He reached into the brazier beside his throne and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, the light caught the metal. Isolde's family crest hammered by her great-grandfather's hand. 3 flames intertwined, rising from a river stone. It had hung in the great hall since before her grandmother was born. Davos held it high for a long moment. Then he opened his hand. The crest fell into the fire. The flames swallowed it whole. Isolde's breath caught. She felt it in her chest like a fist closing around her heart. But her face remained still. This was what Davos wanted to see her break. She would not give it to him. Nerys moved forward with a small velvet tray. On it lay a single ring, simple silver, with a river stone set at its heart. Isolde's grandmother had worn it. Her mother had worn it. Every woman in her line had worn it before her. Nerys lifted it between 2 fingers, held it up to the light, and let it slip from her grasp. It fell into the same fire. The flames consumed it without sound. A low rumble moved through the gathered packs, not quite approval, not quite hunger, just the acknowledgement of a boundary being crossed. Davos descended the dais steps slowly, deliberately. When he reached the center of the great hall, he pointed to the stone floor directly before his throne. Kneel, Isolde. Kneel before the kingdom. She walked forward. Her legs moved of their own accord, muscle memory carrying her through the space between them. When she reached the spot he'd marked, she knelt. The stone was cold beneath her knees. She could feel every eye in the room on her pressing down like weight. "Say it," Davos said. His voice was almost gentle. "Say your family line has ended. Say the name Firehook dies with you." Isolde opened her mouth. She tasted blood. She'd bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to draw it. The copper tang filled her mouth. And she did not speak. A long moment passed. The hall held its breath. "Say it," Davos repeated, no softness left in his voice now. "Or I will exile the last servant still loyal to your house, the old woman who tends your chambers. She will walk into the winter with nothing. Is that what you want?" Isolde's eyes closed. She saw Quiet Hour's weathered face the way her hands shook when she poured tea. She was 70 winters old. She would not survive a night in the cold. Isolde opened her mouth again. A true name does not burn in a traitor's fire. The words came out as a whisper, but they carried. The great hall seemed to contract around them. Davos's face darkened. He'd expected submission, not defiance. He'd wanted to hear her speak the death of her own line to make her complicit in its ending. Instead, she'd refused him the words even as she knelt. Nerys stepped forward, her hand on Davos's arm. Something passed between them, a glance that held calculation. Then Nerys turned to the gathered packs. "Remove every remaining symbol of Firehook from the citadel," she commanded. "The banners, the records, the seals. Burn them or bury them. I do not care which, But this family ceases to exist in Wolfsbane Citadel by dawn. Guards moved immediately. Isolde heard them begin to strip the great hall, the sound of cloth tearing wood, splintering the scrape of furniture being dragged across stone. Davos gestured with one hand dismissing her. Take her to the room beside the armory. Let her contemplate what her pride has cost. They came for her, then two guards with stone faces and no mercy in their eyes. Isolde rose from her knees without their help. She would not be carried. She would not be dragged. She walked between them, with her head level, her shoulders back, even as they led her from the great hall. The room they gave her was small and airless, a narrow window barred, a cot with a thin blanket, and cold, so much cold that her breath misted in the darkness. The armory lay on the other side of the wall, and the outer wall of the citadel lay just beyond that. The wind came through every crack in the stone. Isolde sat on the cot and did not move for a long time. She did not cry. She did not rage. She simply sat in the darkness and the cold, and she understood finally what Davos had truly wanted. Not her death, not even her exile. He wanted her erased. He wanted her name to mean nothing. He wanted a world where Firehook had never existed at all, where the law that bound him, the law she embodied, could be unmade as if it had never been written. And he would use her own compassion to do it. He would threaten every person she loved until she submitted, or he would exile them one by one, until there was no one left to remember her name. Outside, the wind howled. The armory beside her was warm and full. She was alone in the cold. And somewhere in the citadel, Nerys was already beginning to erase the last traces of what Firehook had been. The great hall emptied like a tide pulling back from shore. Isolde stood alone before the brazier, watching the last flames consume what remained of the family crest. The heat had turned everything to ash and blackened fragments. She could feel the weight of what had just happened. Davos's voice still echoing the pack's silence, the certainty that her name was being struck from every record before dawn broke. She waited until the servants had gone. Then she knelt beside the brazier. Her hands were steady as she reached into the cooling ash. The crest had been ancient, carved with symbols that meant something once. Now it was just charred bone and metal. She found what she was looking for, a single blackened fragment small enough to fit in her palm. The edge of it cut her skin. She didn't pull away. An old servant appeared in the doorway. She was one of the few who had served Isolde's grandmother. Her face was lined with fear. "You shouldn't be here," the woman whispered. "By dawn your name comes out of the records, as if you never were. They're already erasing you from the family rolls." Isolde said nothing. She wrapped the fragment in white cloth, the only clean cloth she could find, and tucked it beneath her clothing close to her chest. The cloth was warm from the brazier heat. "My grandmother told me something once," Isolde said quietly. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, like it was coming from very far away. "She said our family was never powerful because of a throne. We were never meant to rule. We were only ever strong because we saved those people everyone else had already thrown away." The old servant's eyes filled with tears. "Your grandmother was a good woman." "She was," Isolde said. She stood. "She also taught me fragments of the old law, things the younger ones forgot. I remember only one piece, but I think it's enough. When the final symbol burns, the smoke remembers the way home." She touched the place where the fragment lay against her skin. It was still warm. The servants who had bowed to her in the hallways that morning now turned their faces away as she moved through the corridors. One woman actually stepped aside and looked at the wall. Another man crossed to the far side of the passage rather than pass near her. It was as though she had already begun to disappear, as though by acknowledging her they would be marked too. The Luna's chamber was on the upper level. Isolde climbed the stairs slowly. The door was sealed, not locked, but sealed with wax and the king's sigil. No one was permitted to enter. She stood in front of it for a long moment, her hand raised but not touching the wood. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the closed door. "I couldn't save you either." She turned away and did not look back. In the darkness of her own small room, Isolde sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand over her heart where the fragment lay hidden. The cloth was still warm. The edges of the charred piece bit into her palm, and she let them. It was real. It was proof. They could erase her name from every page, they could seal the Luna's chamber and pretend the bloodline had simply dissolved, but this fragment existed. It had survived the fire. She understood now what her grandmother had meant. Not power, never power, but memory. The old law was older than Davos, older than the throne he'd taken. And somewhere in the kingdom there would be those who remembered the debt their family had paid. Those who understood that saving the abandoned was not weakness. It was the only thing that mattered. She whispered the words again alone in the dark. If anyone still remembers the debt, follow the smoke. The phrase felt like a prayer, but not to any god. It was a plea cast into the future, a message, in a bottle, thrown into a river that might never reach the shore. But she had to believe it could. She had to believe that somewhere someone would remember what the family had once meant, not the throne, not the titles that Davos was burning away. But the truth underneath that, they had been good. They believed she was carrying ashes, a widow's grief, a broken woman with nothing left. In truth, she was carrying the final proof of an oath, and an oath once made never truly burns. The cold woke her before anything else did. Not the kind of cold that comes from an open door, but the kind that settles into a room when something ancient steps across the threshold. Isolde's eyes opened to darkness, and for a long moment she did not move. The charred fragment lay beneath her pillow wrapped in linen. She could feel it there, not warm, not cold, but present in a way that made her skin prickle. The shadow at the window was too large to be anything human. Gray fur caught what little moonlight bled through the clouds. A wolf, not the common kind that prowled the forest edge. This one's shoulders were level with the window frame. Isolde rose without hurrying, without fear. She crossed the cold floorboards and opened the shutters. The wolf did not move. Its eyes were silver in the darkness, ancient and knowing. Then it breathed and the air shimmered. The transformation was not violent the way she'd heard the stories told, no screaming bones, no tearing flesh. It was a folding inward and outward at once, a moment of double sight, and then an old man stood in the window frame. His skin was weathered like bark. His hair was silver and long braided with something that looked like bone. "Elder Garrick," she said, not a question. "The last bearer of ashes." His voice was rough, like wind through winter branches. He did not call her by her given name. He did not call her Luna. "Did you summon us for blood or for law?" Isolde said nothing at first. The wind moved through the pines outside, carrying the smell of rain and turned earth. Somewhere in her chest, something twisted. "Part of me," she said finally, "wants Davos torn apart, piece by piece. I want him to understand what he took from us before he dies." Garrick's expression did not change. His eyes were the color of smoke. "Blood calls blood," he said. "If you choose that path, the Ancient Ones will answer. They will come hungry, and when they have finished with Davos, they will not stop. Your family's legacy, the restraint your ancestors kept for 300 years, will burn as surely as the ashes burned. You will be the last of something, not a line, a ruin." She felt the weight of that. The weight of every oath sworn in tunnels beneath the earth, every ancestor who chose the law over vengeance. Every night they chose not to let the wolf loose on the world. "I want him to live long enough to understand the law he burned," Isolde said quietly. "I want him to see what he's broken, and then I want him to face what the old covenant demands. Not my rage, his reckoning." A long beat passed between them. Garrick's jaw tightened slightly. "The smoke has been seen," he said. 3 nights now rising from the eastern ridge. The bloodlines have noticed. The ancient oath stirs in its sleep, but it has not yet fully awakened. It waits for a bearer. It waits for proof. He glanced down at the place where the fragment lay hidden beneath her pillow. "To call them before the law, you must stand before them carrying the charred remnant, the only piece of the ashes that remained unburned. You must carry it into the ancestral tunnels and speak the old words. Only then will they emerge to judge." Isolde moved to the window. The rain had started to fall soft and steady. "And if I cannot remember the words—" "The oath remembers them," Garrick said. "The blood remembers. You need only speak what the fragment demands." She looked at him, really looked at him. The lines around his eyes were deep as canyons. "How long do we have?" 3 days, perhaps 4. Once the oath fully awakens, it will not wait. The law demands its answer, and Davos will not remain hidden much longer. Firehook's scouts are moving through the borderlands. They know something has shifted. They can smell the old power stirring. Isolde turned from the window. "Then we go now." Garrick stepped back from the sill, and she understood. She pulled on a cloak, heavy and dark, and felt for the fragment beneath her pillow. The linen was cool against her palm. She could feel it there, not just the physical weight, but something else. A hum, a presence, the bond between her and whatever slept in the earth below the Wolfsbane citadel. They moved through the cabin in silence and out into the rain. The forest was awake around them, every leaf trembling. Garrick led her not toward the main path, but toward the old stone markers that rose from the ferns like broken teeth. She had seen them all her life, and never truly understood what they meant. The ground beneath her feet began to slope downward. There were steps, she realized, ancient steps worn smooth by centuries of footfalls. Garrick moved ahead, and in the darkness his form seemed to blur at the edges caught between man and wolf. "The ancestors will not judge you for wanting blood," he said as they descended. "They will judge you for the choice you make instead. That is where the real power lies. Not in the rage, in the restraint, in the law kept when keeping it costs everything." The air grew cooler as they went deeper. She could smell stone and earth and something else, something old and sleeping and vast. They had not yet reached the chamber where the ancestors gathered, but Isolde could feel them now stirring in the dark below, waiting for her. The fragment beneath her cloak felt heavier with every step. The moment Garrick's hand found hers in that cavern, Isolde knew something had shifted. Sua ten Yunvut Ching. Not just between them, something larger, older was waking. He led her deeper still past the stone markers and the moss-covered thresholds into chambers where the air itself felt ancient. The walls bore carvings she could not read, but her hands knew them. Her skin prickled. She could sense the weight of centuries pressing down from the stone above. When they emerged into the great hall of the Forgotten Lands, she stopped. Wolves stood there, not in shadow, not prowling, standing upright, shifted into their human form and arranged in a circle that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Their eyes were older than the mountains. Their bearing was not deferential. These were not the pack wolves of Wolfsbane Citadel trained to bow and serve. These were the ancient alphas, the ones who had ruled before Davos, before his father, before the fortress was even a name. One of them stepped forward. His hair was silver, his shoulders broad as a doorway, and his voice when he spoke carried the rasp of gravel. "You are the one Garrick brought to us, the girl who healed the king." Saorsa said nothing. The staff in her hands, the one bearing the charred crest fragment, seemed to grow heavier. "We have waited," another voice cut in. This one came from a female alpha whose scars told a story of 1,000 battles. "We have hidden while Davos corrupted the throne, while he murdered the bloodline, while he sent his dogs to hunt the last true heir." She stepped closer, her presence filling the space. "Now we will take what is ours. We will march on Wolfsbane Citadel at dawn. We will tear down his walls. We will put his head above the gates as a warning." A roar of agreement swept through the circle. "No." The word left Isolde's mouth, Sua ten Yunvutching. Before she understood she was speaking. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the sound like a blade. "You will not." The silence that followed was absolute. The silver-haired alpha's eyes narrowed. "You are not a queen. You have no authority here." "No," Saoirse said, and she moved forward, the staff held low, but steady. "But I know what your rage will cost. I have seen what vengeance looks like when it spreads like floodwater. It does not stop at the guilty. It drowns the innocent with them." She could feel the bond, the wordless pull that connected her to every wolf in that space, to the ancient magic that lived in their blood. It was not a command. It was a choice, a plea. "My family name will not be cleansed with innocent blood," she said. The words came from somewhere deeper than her own understanding, but they were hers. Not the blood of the guards who serve because they must. Not the blood of the servants who have no choice in this. Not the blood of the children born in those walls who know nothing of Davos's crimes. Another alpha younger, scarred across his left eye, laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And what would you have us do? Girl, knock on the gates and ask for justice. Davos does not grant justice. He grants only death." "Then we demand a lawful hearing," Saoirse said. "Before all the people, before the realm. We stand at his gates and we demand that he answer for what he has done." "He will not open those gates," the female alpha said, but her voice had changed. It was quieter now, listening. "Then he will seal himself inside," Saoirse replied, "and everyone will know why. Everyone will see a king who will not face his accusers. Everyone will understand that he is afraid." A long moment passed. The ancient alphas looked at one another. The silver-haired one, the eldest, stepped back into the circle. He spoke in the old tongue, the language that moved through wolf and human both, and one by one the others lowered their heads. not in submission, in acknowledgement. When they shifted again, it was not in rage, it was in purpose. The great hall filled with wolves, hundreds of them, their coats dark as midnight, their eyes bright with the clarity of ancient knowing. They would march, yes, but they would march as witnesses, as the voice of the forgotten, as the ones who remembered what the throne was meant to be. Garrick moved to stand beside her, and she could feel his presence like warmth against her side. He did not speak. He did not need to. Dawn came like the turning of a page. The forgotten lands emptied. The wolves transformed back to their human forms, armored in furs and old iron bearing the crests of kingdoms long buried, moved in a river toward Wolfsbane's citadel. Saoirse walked at their head. The staff in her hands was no longer just wood and ash. It had become a symbol, a claim, a truth that could not be unseen. Hundreds of ancient wolves gathered before the citadel's walls. The gates, massive iron-banded built to withstand siege, stood closed. But they did not remain closed for long. Davos appeared atop the wall, his silhouette sharp against the pale morning sky. His face was stone. Nerys stood beside him, and she could see the way his mouth moved, the way he gestured towards Saoirse and the army at her back. His words did not carry to where she stood, but she knew them anyway. Traitor. Usurper. The girl is a witch, a liar, a threat to the crown. Davos's jaw clenched. For a moment she thought he might order the gates opened, that he might come down to face her himself. But then something shifted in his posture. A calculation. A closing. He raised his hand. The gates sealed with a sound like thunder. "You will not enter these walls." His voice rang out across the courtyard, amplified by the ancient stones. "Any who cross this threshold will be marked as enemies of the crown. You will be hunted. You will be destroyed." Saoirse stepped forward alone. The ancient alphas behind her did not move. This was her moment. This was the choice that would define everything that came after. "I demand a lawful hearing," she called out. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "Before the people, before the realm. You will answer for the death of the true bloodline. You will answer for the murders you have committed in the name of this throne." Davos said nothing. "If you will not open these gates," Saoirse continued, "then seal yourself inside. Let everyone see a king who is afraid to face his accusers. Let them understand what he is protecting." The silence stretched, long, unbearable. The ancient alphas behind her were motionless, waiting, watching. This was the moment where everything balanced on the edge of a blade. And in that silence, Saoirse understood something that had been growing in her since the moment she had healed the wounded stranger in her cabin. Loyalty was not given through fear. It was not earned through cruelty or dominion. It was chosen. Again and again it was chosen. The ancient alphas had chosen to follow her not because she was stronger or more ruthless. They had chosen her because she was the only one who had asked them not to become like the darkness they were fighting. The gates remained sealed, but the damage was done. The gates of Wolfsbane's citadel loomed before them, iron-bound and ancient. Isolde stood at the threshold with the ashes wrapped in linen at her side, and the guards at the archway had gone still. They'd seen her face. They'd recognized the bearing of blood and claim. A long moment passed, the kind where breath itself seems to pause. "Open," Isolde said. Her voice carried no anger, no plea, just the weight of what she carried. The captain of the guard stepped forward. His hand rested on his sword hilt, but he wasn't reaching for it. Behind him the other men shifted, uncertain. Something in their posture told her they knew what she held. Not just ash and bone, but law itself, older than Davos, older than the throne he'd seized. King Davos's voice cracked across the courtyard before she could move. "Turn her back. No one crosses these gates without my word." The captain turned to face the king. He was a broad man, scarred at the temple, and when he spoke it was with the kind of weight that comes from generations of duty. "We serve the throne, my lord. We do not serve the man who burned ancestral law." The gates swung inward. Isolde moved through them without hesitation. Firehook was at her shoulder, silent as always. Behind them, the scattered followers, who'd kept faith, a handful of lords, 2 healers from the village Garrick, with his gray-streaked beard and his unshakable conviction. They filed into the great hall like mourners entering a tomb. The space was vast and shadow-hung. Davos sat on the throne at its far end, and she could feel his fury from where she stood. It rolled off him like heat from a forge. "Isolde," he said, standing, "you return as a rebel. You come armed with sedition and the ash of your own blood. I return, she said, as the law allows. She walked the length of the great hall, her footsteps echoed on stone. When she reached the dais, she did not kneel. Instead, she placed the ashes in the center of the floor, right where every lord could see them. The linen fell away as if of its own accord, revealing the blackened crest fragment, the seal of the old kingdom burned but still unmistakable. Silence filled the hall, not the silence of fear, the silence of recognition. Garrick stepped forward then. His voice was old but steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd guarded the true law his entire life. He looked at Davos once, and then he spoke to the assembly. "I name her heir to the blood debt," Garrick said. "By the ancient covenant, she who bears the ashes has the right to call upon the oath." He placed his hand over his heart and began to recite. The words were formal, archaic, the kind that lived in bone and blood in the deep places of the world. The full ancient law spoken aloud in the presence of the crown for the first time in 20 years. When the throne betrays its charge, when the blood is spilled by the hand that should protect it, the bearer of the ashes may call upon the lords to stand witness. And the throne itself shall answer. The stone shall know. The mark shall burn. Isolde felt something shift in the air around her. Not magic, something older than magic. Something that lived in the bones of the world in the ancient contract between ruler and land. Nerys was standing near the throne, and she'd gone very still. Isolde watched understanding dawn across her face. The queen hadn't spoken the law to trap Isolde. She'd spoken it to protect her. But in doing so, she'd activated something neither of them could take back. The ancient markings began to glow. They were carved into the stone floor of the great hall, symbols that had been there so long no one remembered their meaning anymore. They traced a path from where the ashes lay spiraling up toward the throne itself. The light was faint at first, then brighter, burning with a pale gold that cast no heat. Davos's hand was on the armrest of the throne. She watched his fingers curl against the wood as he felt the shift beneath him. The crack appeared first as a hairline fracture barely visible. Then it widened, spreading from the base of the throne like a wound opening. "This is impossible," he said. His voice had lost its certainty. "The law is dead. I burned it." "You burned a scroll," Garrick said quietly. "You cannot burn the oath itself." The lords were moving, not toward Davos, away from him. Firehook watched, with those dark, knowing eyes, as one by one the men and women who'd bent their knees to the king's rule stepped back. Some moved toward Isolde. Others simply removed their hands from their weapons and lowered their eyes. The captain of the guard was first. He dropped to one knee before Isolde, his sword held across his palms in surrender. Then another. Then a third. Davos descended the steps from the throne. She could see him calculating, searching for some way to reclaim what he'd never truly held. He looked at her with pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he said. "When the crown eats you alive, when you realize what it costs to rule, you'll remember this moment and wish you'd let me burn." "Perhaps," Isolde said. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching tiredness, and the knowledge that something had ended here, something old and broken, but still a thing that had been part of the world. But the law will hold. The crack beneath the throne split further. Davos turned and walked from the great hall, and no one moved to stop him. There was no need. He was already gone, just a man now untethered from the power he'd stolen, walking out into a world that would not know him. Isolde looked down at the ashes still glowing faintly in the center of the hall. She thought of the girl in the cabin by the river. She thought of hands tending a wound with no expectation of reward. That girl had learned something essential about the cost of kindness. The world demanded it of you, and it would take everything you had to give. But it was still worth giving. Nerys approached slowly. When she reached Isolde, she knelt not as a subject to a ruler, but as one woman to another. "I did not know what I was speaking," she said quietly. "I only knew it had to be said." Isolde reached down and helped her up. "You knew enough." Around them, the great hall began to settle. The light and the ancient markings faded. The crack beneath where the throne had stood remained a permanent wound in the stone, a reminder, a truth written into the bones of the place itself. The law had spoken, and the law in the end would hold. His voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Arrest her. Take Isolde into the dungeons, now!" The guards did not move. He repeated himself, louder. The words echoed off stone, but the men at the archway stood, rooted eyes fixed ahead, hands at their sides. A long moment stretched. Davos's jaw clenched. He turned to the alphas who lined the walls. Firehook, the last before erasure men who had sworn fealty to him, men who had walked beside him through a dozen winters. I am your king, I command you, move. Firehook stepped forward, but not toward Isolde. He walked to the center of the hall, dropped to one knee, and bowed his head to the woman standing alone before the throne. One by one the others followed, the last before erasure. Then a third alpha and a fourth. Davos watched as the men who had sworn to him turned their backs not in anger but in recognition. They knew what they were seeing. The bond between a true alpha king and his mate was older than crowns, deeper than oaths. No law could sever it. No command could break it. Nerys screamed. She's using dark magic. Wolfsbane sorcery, she's poisoned all of you. Can't you see? She clawed at Davos's arm, her nails drawing blood. My lord, listen to me. This is witchcraft. Garrick stepped forward. His face was weathered, scarred from decades of service. He looked at Nerys, then at Davos, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. I was there the night you took your oath as king. I heard every word. I also heard what you said to her in the corridor before the great hall. I heard you confess. Nerys's face went white. One by one, the witnesses came forward. The steward who had stood in the antechamber, the guard captain who had waited outside the chamber door, the scribe who had been copying records in the next room. Each of them spoke the same truth. Davos had said it himself. The poisoning, the plan, the betrayal of his own bloodline. The words had come from his own mouth, and there was no taking them back. Nerys turned on him, then her eyes blazing. You fool! You weak, pathetic fool! I did it all for you. Everything. And you couldn't even keep your mouth shut for one night. Her voice dropped to something cold and cruel. You were always going to fail. Always. I just made it faster. She wasn't begging, wasn't defending herself. She was simply stating fact, the way you might describe the weather. Davos felt something inside him splinter. She wasn't fighting to save herself. She was already gone. She had already written him off. Even now, even as her own position crumbled, she was calculating, measuring, deciding that he was no longer worth the effort. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. Isolde watched the whole thing unfold without moving. No triumph crossed her face. No satisfaction. She simply stood there still as stone and let the throne choose. Because that's what this was. Not a battle. Not a confrontation. This was the kingdom itself rejecting him. His own guards. His own alphas. The men who had sworn to defend him were instead defending the truth. Davos understood then, in a way that no amount of scheming or planning could have prepared him for, that he had already lost everything. The throne was still his in name only. The crown on his head was now a weight that no one would help him carry. Firehook. The last before erasure, they had made their choice. The family would follow. And without them, without the loyalty of even a single alpha, a king was just a man in fine clothes holding a sword no one would obey. He turned away from Isolde, away from the alphas kneeling before her, away from Nerys, who was being led away by guards, still screaming accusations, still trying to claw at him as they passed. He walked back toward his chambers, and no one followed. No one called after him. The great hall remained silent behind him, the silence of a kingdom that had made its judgment and found him wanting. Later, alone in his rooms, Davos understood the cruelest part of what had happened. Nerys had never loved him. She had used him the way you use a tool, and when the tool broke, she discarded it without hesitation. And he had let it happen. He had chosen her counsel over his own instincts. He had believed her when she told him the Alpha King was weak, that the bond could be broken with enough poison and enough time. He had believed her because deep down he had wanted to believe that power was something you could take, something you could control through force and cunning alone. But the bond between a true Alpha King and his mate wasn't something that could be poisoned or broken. It was something that existed whether he understood it or not, whether he accepted it or not. And his own kingdom had seen that truth more clearly than he ever had. The throne that had once felt so solid beneath him now felt like quicksand. And Davos, for the first time in his life, had no idea how to survive what came next. The great hall fell into a silence that wasn't peace. It was the silence of a kingdom holding its breath before the executioner's axe falls. Davos knelt where Isolde had commanded him to kneel, and the ancient alphas circled like wolves who'd caught the scent of weakness. Their robes dragged across stone. Their eyes were hunger itself. Firehook was the first to speak. His voice carried the weight of centuries of packs that had sworn blood oaths since before the ironwood grew tall. "The throne demands blood," he said. "Not exile, not stripping. His life for the lie he lived, for the kingdoms he endangered, for the name he tried to burn from our records." Several alphas nodded. A tall woman with silver at her temples stepped forward. "Execute him. End this now." Another voice rose, then another. The courtyard became a chorus of voices calling for his death, each one certain, each one hungry for the closure that only blood could offer. Isolde rose from her seat. The movement was small, it was not loud. Every voice stopped, every head turned, and she walked down the stone steps with the ash still clinging to her skirt, with the weight of the restored crown sitting on her brow like something she'd earned through fire itself. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "No," she said. A long moment passed. Firehook opened his mouth to argue. Isolde's eyes met his, and he closed it again. She turned to face the circle of alphas, and when she spoke, each word was carved into the stone beneath her feet. "His blood is too easy. A death and he escapes. A death and the kingdoms whisper that he was a martyr, that he fell defending something he believed in. That is not punishment. That is mercy." She paused. "Let that sink into the bone of every listening pack. Davos will live. He will live knowing that his name is gone. His title is gone. His place in the ancestral hall is erased." She turned to him then. "You came to the throne as King Davos. You will leave it as nothing. No rank, no pack, no recognition in any record that bears the seal of these lands. You are stripped of every title you held, every name you carried, every honor you claimed." The words fell like stones. Then she spoke to the Sathering. "Nerys, the woman he raised above all others, she is stripped as well. No pack will recognize her as Luna. No child will be born under her name. She exists in our records as nameless as though she were never crowned at all. The shame of her husband becomes the erasure of her entire self. They will both know that they are forgotten while the world moves forward without them." But it wasn't the end. Isolde descended the final steps and approached Davos, where he knelt. She held something in her palm, a fragment of ash. Charred and small, it looked like the last remains of something that had once been whole. "You burned the sacred ring. You tried to erase the symbol of what came before you. Now you will forge a new one." She placed the ash into his open hand. "You will go to the northern frontier, the lands beneath the Ironwood where the winters are long and the cold never truly releases its grip. You will guard those lands. Every winter you will stand watch there beneath my restored banner, and you will forge the first metal ring around this charred fragment, not to hide it, not to bury it, but to bind it, to acknowledge it, to carry it with you for the rest of your life." She held his gaze. "Keep this. Let it remind you that a name outlives the fire that tries to destroy it. Your name will live in the stories of what you tried to become. It will live in the memory of every kingdom that saw you fall. That is not honor, Davos. That is not the legacy you wanted. But it is the one you earned." A long beat, no one moved, no one spoke. Firehook stepped back. The tall woman with silver at her temples lowered her gaze. One by one the alphas turned away from him, not in anger, in something worse, in the simple acknowledgement that he no longer mattered enough to hate. He was erased. He would live, and he would carry that erasure with him every single day. Isolde turned back toward her throne. "Take him to the northern frontier. Let him go now. Let him begin his vigil beneath my banner on the lands he will guard until the snow claims him." She paused at the top of the steps. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet enough that only those closest to her could hear. "The ring he forges will be the only name he carries from this day forward." The guards moved forward. Davos did not resist. He stood, and the ash remained in his closed fist, warm against his skin. He looked at the great hall one last time at the throne he would never sit in again, at the faces of the alphas, who would forget him, at the kingdom that had been his, and was now only the place where he had failed. He walked toward the door. The guards flanked him. Behind them, Isolde settled back into her seat, and the ash-stained skirt fell around her, like the wings of something that had burned and risen again. Davos survives, but only beneath the symbol he once tried to destroy. The smithy burned hot for 3 days straight, not with rage anymore, but with purpose. The charred fragment that King Davos had torn from his own crest lay on the anvil, blackened, brittle, a piece of a king's shame made solid. The master smith, his beard singed, his hands wrapped in cloth, heated it once more. Around it, he forged new metal. Gold and silver wound like vines around the ashes, sealing them at the heart of a crest no one had ever seen before. Isolde stood in the doorway of the smithy. She said nothing. She never needed to. The new banner hung where Davos once sat, not in shadow, not hidden away. The ashes remained visible at its center, dark against the brightness, a scar that would not be forgotten. The ancient alphas came one by one to witness it. Firehook was the first. He placed his hand on the crest and swore the blood debt had been repaid with honor. Then the last. Then Quiet Hour. Each one spoke the same truth: the cycle had ended, not with erasure but with remembrance. The law was changed that day, not by decree, by testimony. Isolde rose, through the witnesses who spoke for her, not as a healer, not as a stranger pulled from a river, but as someone who had earned the right to rule. The old servants came forward, the merchants who'd sought refuge in her cabin. Even the guard who'd carried Davos bleeding through the ford testified to what she'd done, how she'd asked nothing, expected nothing, demanded nothing. A long moment passed as the council listened, and then the eldest among them, the servant who'd served 3 kings before Davos, rose to his feet. His knees were stiff. His hands trembled as he walked toward her. He knelt. The others followed, not because they had to, because they chose to. The throne room was quiet when Isolde sat. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of inevitability, like the moment after a great storm when the world remembers how to breathe. She looked at the old brazier where Davos had burned his crest, where he'd tried to end a bloodline with fire. The ashes of that moment were now bound into the metal she would carry as queen. A king burned a crest to end a bloodline, she said, her voice steady and low. From those ashes I rebuild a throne. Davos survived. He lived in the tower at Wolfsbane Citadel, kept safe, kept watched, kept alive with the same care Isolde had given him when he was nameless and bleeding. He would never rule again. He would never wear a crown. But neither would his name be erased from history. He lived as a witness to what he'd tried to destroy, and to what could be built from the ruins of that destruction. The new banner caught the wind, gold and silver and the dark heart of ash at its center. Below it, the kingdom began again. Isolde stood on the rampart one morning, watching the ford run clear, watching the ironwood stand tall beyond it. Brynn lay at her feet. The king's wolf, now hers, his head resting on the stone. She reached down and felt the warmth of his coat beneath her palm. The bond between them was quiet now, no longer desperate, no longer a pull toward survival, just presence, just peace. A long moment passed before she turned back toward the hall. There was work to do. There always was. But now she did it as a queen, not as a healer hiding in a cabin by the river. The difference was everything.